Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Educated Colonist Snap channel. How you doing? So today I want to be talking about top tournament decks for Conquest. There was a recent tournament that just be ended, Snap Battle Arena. I got to cast in a little bit, but I want to talk about some of the decks, some things you can take to use for the future for Conquest, for regular ranked mode, etc., etc. And I do have two things we want to talk about. First things first is I got a comment from viewer, hey, look into disabling autofocus. And I was like, oh yeah, you could do that. So, thank you to Daver. I'm pretty sure the autofocus is gone now, so that stupid, annoying thing won't happen again. Just tell me, guys. Like, I don't know everything, and I don't think about everything, right? So, those kind of things do help. So, thank you for that. Should be gone now. I know. Uh, Second thing, the Marvel Snap did release their developer update, so that's something you can watch if you want to. I'm not going to make a video about it. I think the previous video where we talked about the season pass cards kind of cover a lot of the content there. The only difference is that Legion is a 5.8 instead of a 5.7. So there was a little bit of a buff. I don't know if that's enough to make it playable, but it is something to consider. So that is something you can look and watch. It was pretty good. Definitely a different style compared to some of the other videos. So feel free to watch that if you want. But generally, let's get into the actual topic of the day. Some of the top tournament decks for Conquest. So they did do it's a pretty large tournament. They do it every 2 weeks or so. And a lot of good data comes out of it if you like to be competitive. There's a lot of pretty good information to take advantage of. This first link is just the meta win rates for a lot of decks. You can see their frequency, their presence, right? Like 15% high evolution lockjaw, 15% kitty bounce, right? High evolution control, etc. You can kind of see there's a pretty decent spread. It's not like equal representation or anything like that, right? There's a lot of like Death Destroy, there's a lot of, Shuri Sauron, etc., etc. But you can kind of see like what decks did well, what decks did poorly. The most popular archetype, the High Evolutionary Lockjaw, didn't do the best, right? No appearances in top 8, even though um, it was the most broad. Another thing interesting is like it does say 2 appearances in for Kitty, but it's actually 3 because there's this Kitty tech. It's not like a pure Kitty deck, but it does run Kitty and it's very close to Kitty bounce. So it's more like 3 appearances for Kitty instead of 2. So Kitty did do very, very well in the meta. And it's just I would say like this matchup has a really good matchup into a high evolution lockjaw because you could just be bigger than them, and they don't run any like control. Some people are teching in wave and stuff, but it doesn't look like there was a lot of like wave tech in this tournament format. So a lot of the Kitty decks were able to just run rampant. And another thing, even though the win rate is pretty low, the players that did play it had some good success, right? Like, so maybe on average, it wasn't like dominating the tournament, but the people that knew how to play Kitty, definitely did perform very, very well. So just an interesting list of information. Another interesting thing is there was 3 negative decks brought. 2 of them made top 8. Like that's kind of crazy to me. I'm actually not um against negative. I think there are some good uses with Bask and stuff like that. It's not that bad, but I'm just surprised how efficiently negative did work in. A lot of people seem to think that negative just has this inherent flaw in that if your opponent knows what's going on, they won't let you get a negative game to a good negative game while you just kind of sit back and just win those games that they don't hit negative. But apparently like it was brought in tournament, and we'll talk about the top 8 decks. So we'll talk about the 2 negative decks that did make it there, but just an interesting thing that stood out to me as well once you look at this. All right, so let's kind of showcase. So these are the 8 decks. We're gonna go through them a little one by one, but I just want to have a page with all of them so you could see it at a glance, and you could see like the winner was D Money, and congratulations to him. But something interesting that I did think was a little bit like disappointing is that the kitty decks that made it to top 8 all made it to the top 4. So they didn't lose against any of the other decks that were brought. So I will say like none of the other decks really had good tech into kitty. There wasn't a lot of like, oh, this will mess with kitty that hard. But it's a little disappointing that, oh, okay. It looks like kitty, even in Conquest, even in tournament format, just seems to be the best performing overall for getting the win. Maybe not best performing for like making it deep, but definitely the ones that do make it deep seem to be able to clean up the other deck list. So kind of unfortunate there. All right, but let's look at the actual winner here. So here we have D Money's Make That Kitty Bounce deck. This is, I believe, the same list he brought into the UK tournament, and it's just a pretty like pure bounce deck. There's no tech, there's no Shang-Chi, there's no Iron Man, there's no Chavez as well, which is a pretty contested debate. But did end up winning the whole tournament with this list, so you kind of have to give it up, right? Like the Medusa tech is also pretty cool with the Ant-Man, where you can bounce the Medusa and get it to 2/8, which is pretty scary. Also doesn't get Shang-Chi, so there's a lot going for it, and I definitely think he played it very well. Like this could have been a more pilot diff in a sense. Like he knows his deck inside and out. He played it very, very well. So, but he still got the win there. He still, got through the whole tournament. It's a long tournament, right? There's a lot of participants, so definitely have to give credit to him for getting through to that particular final stage. So this is just kind of another overview. And it just goes to show you how strong kitty can be, even without any tech, right? We used to think that you need to run some tech to deal with the lockjaw matchups, to deal with the big builds. But honestly, if you can just do what you want to do, right? Play the kitty, bounce the kitty, play the other cards, beast it up, falcon it up. You just have so much power with the collector scaling, with the Angela scaling, with the bishop scaling, and then just the kitty part getting procced every single turn. You just get so much power that it doesn't matter. You don't need to Shang-Chi your opponent. You can just be bigger than them, and that's really all that matters there. So definitely was able to make it work with this particular list. Next up, we do have What Am I? So this is another kitty list. It's definitely less bounce heavy. There's no beast, there's no falcon. You're still running the Shang-Chi Iron Man tech, but here instead, now you have this Invisible Woman Killmonger tech on top of this list, right? So since you're not doing bounce stuff and you need to invest 5 mana for this Invisible Woman Killmonger tech, you don't really have the room to run beast. You don't really have the room to run falcon or anything like that. But this one did get second place. There's a lot of like auto wins in here in terms of like if you fight another Kitty Pride deck, you can play Invisible Woman, you can play Killmonger, guarantee that proc to kill their kitty regardless of who has priority or not. And then you can also play your kitty on after the Killmonger to just like be able to save that power where normally your kitty would also get killed. So there's a lot of cool tech here. And I do think this could have been the favorite matchup just because you're playing into a kitty deck with Killmonger. But it does seem like there's just a lot of ways to counter it, and you don't always have the Invisible and Killmonger tech. So you do have to be careful into those matchups where you don't have that counter for it while they still get to do their generic thing. Because if D Money's deck does what it wants to do, which is very likely, and you don't have an answer, you're gonna lose. You don't have enough power to contest the beast bounce up, the falcon bounce. You don't have any of that synergy there. So you're just like a weaker version, but you do have that like reasonable tech into the matchup. So it did do very well. Second place is really strong. It's just did falter a little bit in the end, but I don't think it's because of the deck itself. I just think D Money played it really well. Next up, we have um, another bounce deck. I know, but bounce did really well. So I mean, I have to talk about it here. And it's definitely something you might want to try. I do think in Conquest, people are shifting over from high evolutionary lock shot being something you have to play around into bounce being something you have to play around. So this one is also pretty standard. Another thing I thought was pretty weird in the top 8 was there's no Spider Ham at all in any of the lists. No one is running Spider Ham, which I thought was unusual. I don't actually think it means anything personally. I just think like people just didn't bring Spider Ham, and that's what happened. But I still think Spider Ham is really powerful, really strong. I just thought it was like very interesting that no one made it to top cut with a Spider Ham in their deck. So definitely, if I see more tournaments and there's more results similar to that, then I might have to reevaluate how important it is to have a Spider Ham. But I still think Spider Ham does a lot of work, wins a lot of games for you, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not using this as like, just removing Spider Ham from my decks. It's just interesting that no one was running it. But here, this is very similar to D Money's deck, right? It just doesn't have the Chavez, right, in terms of the synergies, and there's no like Medusa or Emma, any of that stuff. It's just is more like a standard kitty deck, and I think it played into the into this second list in the final turns, and just wasn't able to win. So kind of unfortunate there, but pretty cool list generally. I mean, kitty is pretty standard right now, so a lot of people are aware of how it performs. Now here we come to the more interesting deck list. We have a negative list here, which I would say is not something you would always expect to see in Top Cut, just because it feels like if you know how to play against negative, you know what to avoid, right? You know to avoid if they play Mr. Negative on 3 or 4, those are games you're inherently behind, right? And so don't stay into those games. And I did watch some of the games that were played, and I do have to admit that some of the opponents that are playing to negative deck played out games where they got negative on 3. They played out games where they got negative on 4. And it just seemed weird to me that you would let them play out those games where I feel like if they play negative, don't play it out. They're inherently ahead. Where you could take it slow, just wait until they don't draw perfectly and then punish them. And I think that's eventually what happened here, where at top 4, this is then the players like very aware, like, okay, I gotta be careful about the negative deck. But I was watching some of the top 8 games, and it was like, like, why are we snapping? He played negative on 3, and he's snapping on the final turn. It just felt a little weird. So this did feel more of a knowledge gap. Like if you've played negative yourself, you know when you're weak, you know when you're strong, and it just feel like the opponents kind of gave them the ability to win by letting the negative player snap and play games that they were happy to play into. So, but I do like the list. Let's talk about the list itself. I do like what this list wants to do. It's less reliant on the negative than the other negative list that made it to top 8. This one can still do well. You have the Mystique, you have the Iron Man synergies. So let's say you bask on 1, you can definitely Iron Man for 3, Mystique on for with 3 power as well, and that can really do a lot of damage. So I actually think this list isn't super reliant on negative. It is still reliant on negative. Like let's be aware, like a lot of the good like if you're gonna win easily, you're gonna need negative, but there is other things to do. It's not auto lose, where you would argue like maybe the other negative deck is auto lose. So I do think there are some good advantages to this deck, but I still think it's still a negative deck with the negative weakness that you need to hit in the right circumstances for it to do well. So that's maybe the issue here, but still pretty cool list to see. Definitely love seeing unique lists make it to top cut, and this one did do that particularly well. And next up, now we're getting to some of the more unique stuff, some of the more things that you might not always see around in your decks. And then these did well. They won multiple matches. So they're not bad decks, right? So if you want to try it, this is definitely a good blueprint for running this type of deck in Conquest in tournament settings and see how it does for you. So this one is more of a junk deck. You're giving your opponents useless cards here. You've got the Viper, you've got the Titania, you've got the Sentry. There's no hood for the Viper, and there's no like harness for the Sentry. So you are kind of super reliant on Sentry into a Viper to give it out, or you just lose that lane. So another issue is that the kitty matchup isn't that good, honestly, because you go Storm and they can still tempo out Bishop into that lane. So it's not like they always lose or so. You do have the Storm Juggernaut, which is pretty nice, and you do have the Spider-Man, which is pretty nice. But I feel like that's carrying this deck a lot. Like Storm Juggernaut into Spider-Man is like doing a lot of work compared to some of the other strategies that you might be looking for. So it's a pretty cool list. It also, the Ronan tech is like definitely unique, but you do have Maximus, so you can go like Storm into Maximus, and then Ronan is like pretty powerful. So there's definitely some strategies with this deck, and it did look cool. It did perform decently well, but obviously the kitty decks did kind of have a good matchup into this, so that was the biggest concern. All right, moving on, we do have Thanos control. Every tournament, there's always a couple people playing Thanos, trying to get there, trying to do work here. And I thought this was like a pretty interesting Thanos control deck. I had like one like small issue with it in that I kind of would have preferred the Jeff over the Ghost Spider, but I do think it does allow for more tricks with Ghost Spider, just moving cards that you don't expect. You can also move the Green Goblin. So if you play Green Goblin and Ghost Spider, the Green Goblin will move over to the lane you play the Ghost Spider in, which I've never seen before. So I thought that was pretty cool. So you're trying to lock a lane and then control Professor X Spider-Man the other lane. So it's a pretty good Thanos deck. Like I don't really have too many problems with it. I just thought it was like, it's not unique or in like a particular way that can like deal with the Kitty Pride decks or anything that they played against. So that was like the issue, right? Even though like the cards are good, but it is expensive cards to play, right? You're playing 5 power and 6 power and stuff like that. And the Kitty, and you don't really have an answer to Kitty, so if they kitty you, you still kind of struggle. So that's kind of a lot of the decks that didn't make it to top 4. They all fought a kitty deck, right? And they all lost to that. So it does show like unless you're running like specific tech into kitty, right? Maybe a wave, maybe a Killmonger. It's going to be hard to do like fully well with the into this current, I guess, climate of meta decks. So that was like kind of the issue with a lot of these decks that only made it to top 8. They just kind of weren't able to beat the kitty matchups, and they didn't have any tech for it. So it's just something I guess you should be aware of if you're playing Conquest. Should be aware if you're playing tournaments. Like kitty right now is really powerful, really consistent. So make sure you have something that can do well into that. Maybe a wave or a Killmonger or even like some Electra if you really want to. So just something to be aware of. Next up, we have the Shuri list. So I was actually very scared of playing Shuri in like a tournament format because of the prevalence of Shang-Chi, right? Everyone's thinking about or considering running Shang-Chi, right? You look at all these decks. The only deck that didn't run Shang-Chi, well, it was like the kitty decks, like 2 of them, right? Didn't run Shang-Chi. I think and there was the negative decks also sometimes didn't run Shang-Chi, but most decks will be having Shang-Chi, and you only have the armor to really protect you. So that's the scary thing. If you go like Shuri, you're kind of telegraphing Shang-Chi as well, right? By going Shuri, and then if you don't have priority, which or if you have priority or something, you can just like right into the Shang-Chi. So there's that issue, right? Because you tend to have priority because your early game's really good, right? If you go zero into Ebony Maw, like you're winning the early game, so it can be difficult to just survive in the matchups if they can mess with your Shang-Chi answers, right? If you go Shuri into Red Skull and then they just Shang-Chi you right after, it's like, my Taskmaster's not doing anything, or I've lost the lane, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just that inherent issue, but this did do pretty well, and I think this is a pretty good Shuri list. I actually think the Sauron's more important than Shuri in this list. Like, I think you'd win more games if you get the Sauron on 3 compared to getting the Shuri on 4. Just because it fixes up so many of your cards, right? The Lizard, the Melt, the Maw, the Mary, the Skull. It just fixes so many of your cards. So definitely think if you like Shuri, you like that playstyle, this is still a deck that can run well. It obviously still has some issues, and you are like relying on hitting some of your key cards, but it did do well. If you like this type of playstyle, feel free to take it and run with it and adapt it to your own particular niche. And then the last list, I think is also the weirdest one, is Morph Negative list, and I honestly, this list surprised me that it kept winning. I'm not hating here, but I'm just like looking at it and like, wow, it beat a lot of like good players here. And this one is definitely way more reliant on hitting negative. But I think, that's I guess fine in that sometimes like the deck without negative is gonna struggle regardless. So this one's just like, oh yeah, if we're hitting negative, we win. If we don't hit negative, okay, well, move on to the next one. But a lot of people just struggled, and I think here, like, the player played it out well, played it aggressively, snapping early as soon as they have the read that they're going to have a good game, and just making your opponent like second doubt themselves, play a matchups that they shouldn't be playing in, right? So it's something that you can do if you're playing like a Hela deck or a negative deck, any deck that's very combo driven. But if you have the combo, you snap when you have the combo, people will leave. If you just snap earlier, like if you snap turn 1 with the combo, like it's hard for your opponent to be like, oh, do they have a turn 1? Like, I don't know. So am I going to stay in? And then you're playing for more Qs than you need to. So I think like, so the opponent played this out well and was just like getting your opponent to stay in, snapping aggressively, making sure that if they have any advantage, they make sure your opponent's paying for it. So definitely a cool usage of the deck to kind of get to top 8, which I thought is really impressive. And any morph lovers in chat, right? Like I'm just like, wow, got to top 8 with a morph in there. And apparently it did like decide the game as well. So yeah, like pretty good card apparently. But yeah, definitely an interesting list for sure. Don't know if I would. I've actually been dabbling with some negative lists in Conquest. Don't know if I'd run like this exact list, but I can see the appeal. Like it's a fun list to play. Definitely one of the funner lists. And if you like to just chill out, enjoy some games, jam some negative, this is something you can do. So definitely thought it was a cool tournament. And just like going back and looking at the hierarchy of the deck metas, right? You can see Kitty doing very well, and then a lot of the other decks were like kind of not as like interesting. Patriot has a pretty good win rate, even though they didn't make it the top 8, and things like that. So there was just like some cool decks to be found, and always interesting to look at tournaments. I don't always like make videos about them, but usually when I'm invited to it, then I'm very invested in the games itself, and then maybe I just make a video about it afterwards. But yeah, definitely some interesting tips to look out for. I guess the takeaway overall would just be like, play Kitty or play something that can deal with Kitty as well, and still high evolutionary lockjaw is still very popular. So it might lower a bit after people keep showcasing that you can just beat it beat it on stats with Kitty, and Kitty might be more popular. But I do think you want to be aware of the popular cards in the meta, whether it's Kitty, whether it's High Evolution or Lockjaw. Destroy is also pretty popular right now. So those kind of things are things you want to be aware of. So just some tips, some ideas, and some use cases for your own Conquest games. Hope you guys enjoy it. What do you think about the no autofocus? It's so much better, dude. I was like, wow, I didn't know I could fix this. But I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and have a wonderful rest of your day. I also need to change the outro. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be